Shall we start? Are you ready? Okay. Well, Dambash, hello everyone. My name is Sardar Sadi, and I'm the director of the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Rojava. On behalf of the Institute and the university, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the first public seminar of our summer school program. I'm just going to mute you, Mr. Rohan. Okay. Sorry. This summer school titled Decolonization in Kurdistan and Beyond, Theory, Methodology, Practice is the outcome of a collaborative project between the University of Rojava, the University of Bremen, and the Center for Solidarity and Cooperation with Universities of North and East Syria, CSCUNES. With this program, we are honoring the 10th anniversary of the Rojava Revolution with the strong belief that the revolutionary experience in Rojava and Northeast Syria region provides a historical example for decolonization all around the world. The people of Rojava and Northeast Syria have proven that the real change towards a better future for historically colonized, marginalized, and excluded people who are indigenous to their lands is possible. Rojava Revolution has much to contribute to theories, methodologies, and practices of decolonization. At the same time, we want to put Rojava's experience in conversation with other experiences around the world, and this summer school is an opportunity for that. The summer school will take place in this month, June 2022, and it has two forms of sessions. A, closed seminars between MA students at the University of Rojava and the University of Bremen, and B, public seminars and workshops with speakers from diverse backgrounds of scholarship and activism on decolonization in Kurdistan and around the world. The program will conclude with a joint symposium between students at the University of Rojava and the University of Bremen. Today, we are honored to host Havin Günasher for the first public seminar, who will talk about decolonization in Abdullah Öcalan's political philosophy. Öcalan has provided a guiding paradigm for the Rojava Revolution and for the people of the region, and we are pleased to have Havin with us today to talk about it. I will introduce Havin in a bit, but before, let me make some housekeeping notes. First, we have interpretation option from English to Kurmanji and vice versa. In case during the discussions period somebody speaks Kurdish, you can select English, but the main language will be English for this seminar. You can click on the globe icon on the right bottom side of your Zoom page and select Kurdish or English. Second, we will have about half an hour for discussions after Havin's talk. Please write your questions in the Q&A box in the webinar room or in the comment section, and I will read it to Havin. And maybe if someone wants to talk, you can just raise your hand and I allow you to talk. And I will say that's the interpretation part in Kurdish. Havalno imkana vergarandinj English bo Kurdi Kurmanji haya. Hum dikarin l'ser ikona jihan and globe kulibine raste rupala waya zumea bikirtinen u Kurdi halbjere. Today we also have Mr. Rohan Mustafa, the co-president of the coordinating body of universities of North and East Syria, which includes the University of Rojava, University of Kobani, and newly established University of Al-Sharq. Mr. Rohan will talk about decolonization in education programs, and especially in higher education, and kind of providing an introduction for the universities of the region and how the Rojava Revolution has been actualized in the education programs of North and East Syria. So without further ado, I welcome Mr. Rohan Mustafa and Mr. Rohan تتكارين هذا سبيبكي. أجر كاميرا خوشي باكي
تمام. والله برسبيك جبرك جمال أستبلي بوما أزنج جيكارم.
تمام. كلام
دم باش بو حمكاسين كيرو مرا حاضر دي كمين سمينارا مكتبة هابيني بو دبن سرپرشتيا انستيتيا زانستين جواكيا زانينغها روجافا هاتيا بارستن وطابي بهفكاريا زانينغها بريمن ونافندا بشكري وهفكارية
The
دقازة
cooperation between University of Bremen as
أتنا حمو كسان دكن وأم سباسيا كسين كل سر في بروجي ساكنين سباسيا كبر مازن مجوارا دكش بركو براستي سمينارم في أواي بروجيم في أواي جبوما وك زانينجهم باكوجراتي سوريا تشتكى بر بنرخو جرينجن طيبات دواري جباك ناسية دا جبركو يعني جباك ناسية طيبات كو زانينجهم باكوجراتي سوريا خاد سبيري فلسفة دم نتوى ديمقراطيك كو رخنيا جباك ناسية كو هاي دكا جبو ما افتشتكي بر جرينجا طيبات جبو قالكي وك ما وك كورد كو حرتم دبن ميتنجارية دابو أو دسلدارية دابو كو ندهشتن كو پروردهيا بزماني دايكي خوش بمشه يعني آزاد بمشه حرتم كورد ج پروردهيا بزماني خوا ج چند خوا هاتبون درخستن و هاتبون شافتن براستي جبو ويجي يعني جبو ما زانينجهم باكو جراتي سوريا تجربة كنوية لي ام خادسبيرن ديروكا في هرمي چاندا في هرمي كو حمو زانست جدي هرمي كو دركتيا و خادسبيري في هرمي جبو ماجي نتشتكي نوية لتجربة كنوية لي بنجهك ما فلسفي ديروكي هيك و ام خادسبيرن براستي يعني زانينجهم باكو جراتي سوريا يا ام حميد زانن يك جبر همي شورشا روجافا باكو جراتي سوريا او شورشا كو دحمي ملاندا خبري خستنكر ويك جوان قادا اكاديميك زانينجه وزانس بوجي جبو ماجي يعني درفت كين بون زحمتي جي هبون لي داخاز هبو ارادك هبو كو ام زانينجهن كل روجافا باكو جراتي سوريا ابا بكن كو ببن زانينجهن الترناتيف زانينجهن هي ام خزانن تقص لدنيا زانينجه هنا لي مخابن اف زانينجه نبون برسيب جبو برسكريكن نهاكو ام جيان دكن جبركو حمي زانس و زانينجه حرتم ببون نافندا كوركرنا برسكريكان جبركو خج جواكي قدكر خج برسكريكي جواكي قدكر وبون سدما خورتكرنا و آلوزيان د حمي ملاندا وك ام زانن چجمله آبوری دا چجمله بیرکاری دا فیزیک دا کیمیا دا چاندنی دا همه زانستن هایی بون سدن خراکرنا خوازا ایکولوژی و کشتنا مروفان و تالانکرنا مروفاتی براستی جبو ایجی مخواست يعني دمي ما بريار داك وام زانينجهن خا آوا بکن یعنی نتنی جبو ام در فتا خواندن جبو خانده کاران بکن راسته اف پیوسته ام پیشروجا جوان خوا ام بفکرن و در فتا خواندن یا دا اصلا اک بلند ام بفکرن لی ارمان جامعه سرکش کو ام ببن زانینگهن آلترناتیف جی زانینگهن هی زانینگهن کو سر بنگه کا آزاد و دموکراتیک آوا بن جبو جي يعني براستي ام زحمتيان جي دبينن جبركو دمي مروف دخوازي اشتكي نو دجباكا كيكو بحزارن سالان دبن دسلداريه دا هاتيا پرورده كرن و هاتيا جيان كرن يعني وي زحمتي قلق هبا لي ام هدي دملي ريفا برني دا ام سيستمكا alternative افادكن دملي نوروكن ماتريالن خا دملي تايبت او ماتريال زانستين جواكي كو ام كاربن يعني ام رخنيا زانستين هي بكن جبركو خاج جواكناسي قد كرن و زانستين جواكي و جواكناسي كرن دا استا هري نظم يعني يا هري داوي جرينجي حرتم دان زانستين بیرکاری و فیزیک و کیمیا و مخابل جواک بوینی هاتن قد کرن جبو جی مخاص کو زانستین جواکی ببا اساس حمو زانستان و حمو زانست و زانیاری يعني چافکانی آخا جواکی بگرن جبوكو ببن برسل جبرسكليكين جواكي وببن شارسري جبرسكليكين كونها وآلوزين كونها أمجي عندكن جبو يجي يعني نظام يعني بقشتي زانينجهم كونها هي أذكارن بكورتاسي يعني ده 2015 زانينجها عفرين هذا ده مزراندن لما خابن أف زانينجه بشتي داقر كرنا عفرين يجي هلا تركيا وشتين وي هذا قرتن مخابن بشتي وي ده 2016 زانينجها روجافا لقامش له هذا مزراندن ده 2017 زانينجها كوباني لكوباني هذا ده مزراندن ويا هريداوي زانينجها الشرق ده 2020 كان لباجار رقة هذا ده مزراندن أو يجبو كيكاتين عرب يعني زماني بروردي لور بزماني عربية جبركو فلسفة كوزانينجه ما خادسبيري فلسفه وچاندا ببرين برچاندي برزماني يعني جما في حرقه لكي كو بزماني خا بچاندا خا پرورده خا بستينه جبوجي يعني ام درفتان جبو حمي بكاتيان ودكن كو باصلا زانينجا هنده بزماني خا پرورده ببينن چ بزماني كردي به بعربي به وزماني بكاتي دندن يعني بكورتاسي مدخست ازوي بيجن وجارة كدن ام سركفتني جبو كارو خواتا استتيا زانستين جواكي ام دخازن و ام سپاسیا کسین کو سروی پروژه سر مکتبه هاوینه دیسکنه ام سپاسیا وان دکن و ام سرکفتنی شخواتا وان دخاز.
Gelik spas Mr. Rohan. Thank you so much. And now let me introduce our speaker for today's seminar. Havin Güneşer is the author of The Art of Freedom, Brief History of the Kurdish Struggle, a book published by PM Press in 2020. She's an engineer, journalist, and women's rights activist who writes and speaks extensively on the topic of the revolution in Rojava. She is one of the spokespersons of the international initiative Freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan. And she has translated several books of Öcalan. David Graeber, the late anthropologist and one of the greatest supporters of the Rojava Revolution, once said, quote, Havin Güneşer is not just the world's leading authority on the thought of Abdullah Öcalan. She is a profound, sensitive, and challenging revolutionary thinker with a message the world desperately needs to hear, end of quote. So let's hear from Havin. Please, Havin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sardar. You've really made it so much weighty upon me at the moment with mentioning of especially David Graeber. I'd like to also commemorate him because he was indeed one of the first public intellectuals from around the world who was able to see the revolution in Rojava, despite the many different dimensions that were directed at the revolution so that it would be unclear what was going on there. So yes, David was indeed a very important person for all of us. And I want to thank you and also, of course, Rohan, Mamusta Rohan, and as well as, of course, Ulrike, who is unable to be here. Please give her our greetings and best wishes. I hope she's better soon. And of course, the University of Rojava and University of Bremen for organizing such a series of lectures, especially, I think, what better way of honoring the anniversary of Rojava Revolution than to discuss this colonization process that's been going on, and perhaps to be able to expose how the Rojava Revolution, with the paradigm of Abdullah Öcalan, is trying to find its way through all these processes. So thank you for all the introductions and for conference, these seminars. Now, for decades, I'd like to start a little bit from the basics, because I'm not sure, those who are listening to us, how much they know of the colonization process of Kurdistan and Abdullah Öcalan's political philosophy. Now, for decades, there have been many articles and talks on Kurdistan, or the Kurdish issue, the Kurdish question, but they all started in one the same way, that Kurdistan is divided into 4 parts. Probably most of you have heard this at some point in time, someplace. While this division has been the case for almost 100 years now, Abdullah Öcalan is the person who introduced the notion that there is a colonial situation into the political discourse. His whole development as a philosopher, writer, and political leader rests on the conclusions he arrived at in the early 1970s, that Kurdistan is a colony, and he developed all this in more than 60 books he has written since then. Unlike the overseas colonies of European empires, he analyzed Kurdistan as an internal colony of the 4 nation states that occupied it. From this analysis and the resulting anti-colonial standpoint, he developed his political philosophy, which since has expanded in many directions. But even when he writes about women's freedom or the history of civilization, the notion of decolonization permeates all of Öcalan's thinking. During the years of ideological formations, that is since mid-1970s, Öcalan and his friends were heavily influenced by anti-colonial struggles like the ones in Vietnam, Angola, Algeria, and of course the ideas of Frantz Fanon. In the beginning, critique targeted the colonizers in all areas of life. In this case, initially more the Turkish Republic. The aim was first to expose the official ideology in the ideological arena, and then to overcome the colonizers in terms of their imposed ideology. Without such an ideological unmasking of the colonizers and the forming of an ideology of one's own, it was not possible to organize a national liberation movement. The more the group clarified their thoughts and exposed the colonization, the more they could reach the people. Knowledge about this conflict was for a long time, and still is to a large degree, not only limited, but also interest and profit driven. And because it is taking place in one of the most central regions of the Middle East, both with respect to demography and geostrategic importance, this deficit often results in a one-sided and superficial analysis of this complex problem and leads to tragic outcomes. Since 1999, after the abduction of Abdullah Öcalan, and more so after the revolution in Rojava in 2011, Kurds are better known in Europe and around the world. The Kurdish question, especially with its newly articulated paradigm, has become the litmus paper for what kind of not only a regional system, but a world order will come out of the present chaos, which Öcalan calls the Third World War. But let's see what I mean by all of that by getting into more detail. Now, if we give a short history of the colonization of Kurdistan, we can say that Kurds are autochthonous in the region. And being located close to the center of a multitude of empires throughout history, Kurdistan was colonized again and again by different forces and in different manners, the last of them being the Arabic Islamic expansion, the Mongols, the Iranian Safavid Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Kurdish partition was even further deepened, which exasperated the atmosphere of violence even further. The rising imperialist powers, Britain and France, redrew the boundaries in the Middle East, and Kurdistan came to be ruled under the Turkish Republic, the Iranian throne, the Iraqi monarchy, and the Syrian French regime. Under the impression of the loss of large parts of its former territories, Turkey switched over to a strict policy of assimilation in order to enforce the unity of the remaining parts of the former empire, and it interpreted the building of a nation state in the worst possible manner. it proceeded to exterminate all indications of the existence of a culture other than the Turkish. They even banned the use of the Kurdish language. Iran proceeded in a very similar way. The Shah established a terror regime at the beginning of the 20th century. The rebellions and the emancipation struggle of the Kurdish Republic of Mahabat were totally crushed. In the Iraqi and Syrian parts of Kurdistan, Britain and France suppressed the Kurdish emancipation efforts with the help of their Arab proxies. Here too, bloody colonial regimes were established. Now, of course, when the European colonialism was added, which was driven by ambitions for geostrategic supremacy and boundless greed, the interventionist policy in the Middle East became increasingly colonialist at the beginning of the 20th century. Intertwined with the Cold War, this added a new form of colonization to what the Kurds had already experienced over the course of history. Öcalan analyzes that with the coming of capitalist structures, from which the Kurds were mostly excluded, the development-related divide between them and the Arab, Turkish, and Persian hegemonic societies grew larger. We may at some points evaluate this to be something positive, but the power structures of the feudal rule mingled with the bourgeois capitalist power structures, which helped to preserve the dominance of their corresponding nations. Although these structures depended on imperialism, these societies were able to build up their own national economies, further develop their own cultures, and stabilize their own state structures. In the areas of science and technology, a national elite was coming of age. They forced all other ethnic groups in their countries to speak their language. With the help of a nationalist domestic and foreign policy, they created a national ruling class, which saw itself as a hegemonic power with a view to the other ethnic groups. Police and military were expanded and strengthened in order to break the resistance of the peoples. The Kurds were not able to respond to that. They were confronted with an aggressive national chauvinism of the states that had or held the power in Kurdistan. And the legitimacy of their power was explained with various ideological constructions. Indeed, the state and power structures became equated with a particular nations instead of states based on a particular region, a particular religion in the past. So the hegemonic powers like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria denied the Kurds their existence as an ethnic group. In such surroundings, the Kurds ran a great risk when they referred to their Kurdish roots. If people did so in spite of this great danger, they could not even expect to be supported by their own ethnic group. For many Kurds, open commitment to their origin and culture resulted in exclusion from all economic and social relations. If they still insisted, despite this could indeed mean facing physical violence and death. Therefore, many Kurds for a long time, and some still do that, denied their ethnic descent or kept quiet about it. And the respective regimes pushed this systematically. This denial strategy produced a lot of absurdities. For example, the Arab regime, for them, the Kurdish question did not exist. It had been resolved long ago by enforced Islamization. They were sure of this. Islam was the only nation, and this nation was Arab. Therefore, they were sure what they did in Kurdistan did not count as colonization or indeed occupation. The Persians even went further and made the Kurds an ethnic subgroup of the Persians. In this way, the Kurds were allegedly granted all their rights in a very natural way. Kurds who nonetheless demanded their rights and stuck to their ethnic identity were regarded as people who threw mud at their own nation, the Persian nation, and who therefore had to receive the appropriate treatment. The Turkish regime derived its claim for supremacy over the Kurds from alleged campaigns of conquest in Anatolia 1,000 years ago. There had not been other peoples there. Therefore, Kurd and Kurdistan are non-words. They are not existent and not allowed to exist according to the official ideology. The use of these words equals an act of terrorism and is punished correspondingly. Like Persian and Arabic before, now Turkish too became a hegemonic language by force. While the Kurds of the old times before modernity had been able to preserve their culture and language, despite the layers of other modes of colonization, these were now pushed back by the three hegemonic languages and cultures, which also had all the modern media and communication tools at their disposal. Kurdish traditional songs and literature were banned. Thus, the Kurdish language, which had produced many works of literature in the Middle Ages, was threatened in its existence. Kurdish culture and language were declared subversive elements. Native language education was banned. The hegemonic languages became the only languages that were allowed in the educational system, and thus the only languages used to teach the achievements of modernity and see the culture as very backward. The Turkish, Persian, and Arab nation states pursued a systematic assimilation policy using varying repressive means, both institutionally and socially, denying the Kurdish language and culture, or indeed existence, any legitimacy. The old school left, on the other hand, due to real socialist world and capitalist world's division of the world among them, looked at any demand by the Kurds as being either nationalist or a pawn in the hands of the imperialist powers who wanted to colonize the Middle East. So what did the Kurdish movement do in this situation of cultural annihilation and denial? What could have been an appropriate response for an anti-colonial movement when considering all these dimensions of Kurdish colonization? From the years of ideological formation until the 1980s, the PKK mostly directed ideological critique at the Turkish state and exposed how it colonized Kurdistan. It focused less on economic exploitation, but especially on the effects of colonialism on the mindset of the oppressed. So Frantz Fanon's seminal Black Skin, White Masks was an important text in this regard. They saw the effects of the above policies on the Kurdish individual and society. Most Kurds had either abandoned or were too scared to admit to their Kurdishness. These years were also the years where a fierce discussion of whether the Kurds existed or not took place among the Kurds themselves. With no books or archives available, this became a very difficult venture. For the Turkish state's part, it had ordered universities to write scientific research on how the Kurdish people were actually mountain Turks. As the practice of the Kurdish freedom movement developed, Öcalan saw that despite exposing the created colonial mindset and a more comprehensive preparation, problems of disparity between theory and praxis were not overcome. This required a deeper analysis of the Kurdish society and the Kurdish individual. They began to expose the effects of colonial ideology and its results in different areas of life of the Kurdish society, from religion, the philosophy of life, from social relations to approach to nature, to family, to women among themselves, the intellectuals and their relation with the society, and the list goes on. Thus, there was a huge body of analysis developed around the personality question, the search for a free Kurd that is free of colonial influences, or rather the discussion of what is a Kurd and thereby what is a free Kurd became an important aspect of the struggle the PKK waged. the ideological, economic, and violence-based colonization of Kurds and Kurdistan was exposed at all levels. The concepts of freedom, love, morality, and all of this was taken at hand in detail. The eagerness with which the members of the Kurdish society tried to distance themselves from their own society, the way in which Kurdistan as a physical entity was portrayed as worthless, barren, and not beautiful in their mind, and thus not something not only worth fighting for, but something not also worth living in, became understood and critiqued. This all culminated in a saying stating that the Kurds cannot come together by the colonizers, and that if they did, they would fight one another, and there can never be a union among them. The state made sure that this was the case, though, by playing them against one another. It's so telling what we are experiencing in South Kurdistan at the moment. This made it almost impossible to bring the Kurds at that point in time together in a movement and in harmony to struggle against the colonizers. Add to all this the fact that in the minds of most of the Kurds, as a result of severe terror and violent campaigns, the Turkish state power became insurmountable. To give only one figure here, more than 600,000 people, more than 500,000 people were detained and tortured after the 1980 military coup in Turkey, and majority of these people were in Kurdistan as well. The colonizers usurped and appropriated the knowledge of the colonized in all areas too. Repression was applied, above all, to ways of knowing, ways of producing knowledge, ways of producing perspective, images, and imagination in general. And they wanted to leave no one who could do that for the Kurdish society, or that the Kurdish society could do that for itself and the individuals for themselves. And I guess this was why the PKK gained such a stronghold in the Kurdish society, and that Öcalan has such a special place amidst the Kurds, because he and the Kurdish freedom movement dared to imagine that there can be an alternative, that there can be another way of living. The officially imposed beliefs and images did not only serve to stop the cultural and political production of the subjugated, they also served as a very effective means of social and cultural control when oppression ceased to be direct, continuous, and systematic. Along with repression, exploitation, and cultural and physical genocides, they educated some of those they dominated in a partial and selective way in order to incorporate some of them into their institutions of power. Because power, beyond being an instrument of oppression, is quite seductive. Thus, cultural Turkification became an aspiration, or Arabification, or becoming Persian, a way to have the same material privileges and power as the Turk, the Arab, the Persian. Therefore, hoping that the survivors would have no intellectual, cultural, and political imagination outside that of the rulers. As an additional element to this, the European colonization of the Middle East deprived Kurds of legitimacy and recognition. Kurds were now deemed non-existent in these nation states, the states that existed basing themselves on a single nation, single religion, and single flag. And they were even considered a nuisance. Today, as a result, all international mechanisms are still closed off to the Kurds. The Kurds' ability to call these states to accountability is non-existent. For instance, Saddam Hussein was never tried for his crimes against humanity committed against the Kurds. He was executed before such a trial could take place. In the case of ISIS, we are now celebrating and honoring the revolution in Rojava, but there is no international tribunal as we speak, despite the horrendous crimes that is widely acknowledged. Also, no Turkish government is ever criticized, including the recent ethnic cleansing in Afrin, for the ongoing cultural, political, and physical genocide of the Kurds. The European colonization is a very important and decisive factor in this. So what are the connections to the world system and imperial world powers? As the struggle went on, Öcalan deepened his analysis of the connections between the colonization of Kurdistan by the regional powers, namely Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and that of the world powers. The fact that at the time, aside from parts of the Palestinian movement, neither the Soviet Union nor any of the other real socialist states ever supported the movement was telling. When in fact, Sweden in 1986 and Germany in 1993 were the very first states to ban the PKK, the dimensions of the colonization by the world system became more and more clear. At the same time, the assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was wrongly but intentionally blamed on the PKK, despite the absence of any evidence and despite the positive approach of Palme on the Kurdish question. The November 1993 German ban of the PKK came as a result of widespread protests in Germany against the Turkish bombing of the Kurdish town of Lice. Thus, the ban served to camouflage the severe Turkish state terror and annihilation efforts. Both bans came at a time of immense human rights violations against the Kurds in Turkey and expressed open support for the Turkish state. Thus, all of this helped the Turkish state to build the discourse of separatism and terrorism against the PKK and to camouflage the colonization and occupation by the Turkish state. However, the PKK was an outcry against what was happening in Kurdistan and in Turkey. In the 1980s, after the military coup, the repression against the society in Kurdistan and Turkey, and in the 1980s, after the military coup, the repression against the society in Kurdistan and across Turkey, and later in prisons against the PKK revolutionaries are infamous. Again, in the early 1990s, especially 1992, 1993, the Kurdish society took to the streets for the first time in a long time to demand their collective and individual rights. So the bans should be looked at in view of these developments. In this context, it may be important to talk about the Republican era as the most critical phase of Turkish-Kurdish relations and colonization of Kurdistan and the role of the German state. In his book, Beyond State, Power and Violence, Öcalan states that in Turkey after 1923, the traditional Islamic ideology was replaced by nationalism. Turkish nationalism was fed by two external sources. First, the historical and social knowledge acquired from the intellectuals among the Kazan Turks, who were subjected to the repression of the Tsarist Russia via Europe. They, for the first time, tried to show that there was a Turkish history outside the history of the Ottoman dynasty. The second source was the German Empire, which was a latecomer in the colonization process. Germany wanted to use the Turkish communities to expand east toward Central Asia, and therefore tried to entice both pan-Islamist and pan-Turkish currents, including supporting their respective doctrines. The idea was to use both of these ideological currents to foster Islamist and Turkish chauvinist uprisings against Tsarist Russia to create opportunities for expansion. Beginning in the 1880s, Germany dislodged England and France from their place at the side of the Ottoman Empire and continuously expanded its influence. As a result, the defeat of Germany in World War I also destroyed the Ottoman Empire. Feeding on German and expatriate Turkish sources and inspired by German nationalism, the nationalism of Turkey gained an increasingly racist character. At that time, German historians pursued and held in high esteem ideas like purity of race. This nationalism aimed to rally the whole Turkish world around the similar racist nationalist flag, clearly befitting the intended route of German expansionism. The fact that this approach was detached from historical and social reality would later cost the Ottoman Empire dearly and continues to cost the Turkish state dearly, but nevertheless is still in implementation. German state support continued throughout all the ideological shades of the Turkish state at the cost of Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, Pontus, and increasingly more so the Kurds. Now, I want to extend the application of analysis of Öcalan's definition of colonialism to other contexts. So Öcalan later took further steps, widening the historical analysis of colonization and applying it to other cases or contexts. In examining the very first status civilizations in the Middle East, like the Sumerian states 5,000 years ago, the Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian empires,
وکی سومریان، اکادی، آسوری، بابیلونیان و بابیل وانا جزدسپیک و پارچه جوان دولت بو. باجار سومریان به تایبەتی تیمبر ایوان پیدویان به چافکانیان هبون و لوما وان باجار و هرمین جیران دار پار وکرن داکو چافکانی وان بکار بینن. ده افسانه گلگامشته جی اف هیه. و وی چاقی جی کالین کردان این وی درجی کرد وی چاقی جی توشی و کولونیالیزم بونه.
Socialist countries for not going beyond capitalism in many respects, including women's freedom and militarism. In the second half of the 1990s, he coined the slogan, "Killing the male," in the discussion and efforts to understand the enslavement and colonization of women. While the colonization of Kurdistan and its connection to NATO had always been evaluated, and there were various attempts since 1993 by Öcalan and the movement to resolve the Kurdish question within the borders of each nation state, the roots of what Öcalan calls the societal problem was not yet clear for him. Finally, Öcalan's abduction in 1999 drove him to more radically determine and expose the roots of colonization, power, state, force, and hierarchy. In doing that, Öcalan finds the root of all colonizations, the colonization of women. This, he says, is the initial colonization that has taken place before all the others. In fact, he sees the colonization of the women as the beginning and continuous colonization of those outside the patriarchal civilization. He points out that the colonization of men, nature, territories, and cultures can only be possible after the colonization of women and the way of life around her is achieved. He determines that it is the relationship of domination between men and women that lies at the root of all the relations that maintain diverse inequalities, enslavement, despotism, fascism, and militarism. Through the experience within the PKK and Kurdish society, Öcalan understands that if concepts like equality, freedom, democracy, and socialism, if they should be validated in a way that won't prove a disappointment, they need to be disentangled. And the web of relations around women must be torn apart. This understanding then leads to an analysis and attempt at a decolonization process of women, culminating in genealogy. So just as we say that Kurds go through a Turkification, Arabization, or some other colonization process, women too are put through a process in which they acquire patriarchal traits. Or in the same way as, say, a colonized individual distrusts the other members of their own group, or are made scared to gather together for fear of repression, women too, for a long, long time, and still do, are made to acquire such distrust about one another through ideological, political, social, psychological, and most often legal precautions. They are deprived of the possibility to organize themselves. In fact, any acts of defiance and/or self-defense are immediately punished in numerous ways. This resembles the colonization of different groups based on ethnicity or class. So Öcalan arrives at the conclusion that objectification, enslavement, and subsequent colonization occurs in three ways: first applied to women, and then mimicked to the present day with refinement. These three ways are ideological construction and monopoly on knowledge, usurpation of economy and monopoly imposed over economy by force, use of violence, and monopoly over violence. Now, a quick look at the ways in which colonization of all the different groups shows us that all these three are effectively used intertwined and are combined under the nation state into a single monopoly to achieve the ever-growing colonization of the society. Let's take a closer look at the second element, Öcalan's take on usurpation of economy from women and her total exclusion from economy in a very different light. He interprets various sources to this end, including mythology. Öcalan evaluates that economy, even if not as a concept yet, but in terms of its essence, can be traced back to the Neolithic, the woman-centered society, and the way in which the surplus product, however limited back then, was first accumulated. The word economy, he says, oikos and nomos, is the Greek word for house and law custom, thus means something like household economy. The emergence of the initial gathering and farming centered around the woman, and the possibility of preserving them well in storage places, says Öcalan, led to the birth of economy. However, this was not an accumulation for trade or the market, but an accumulation for the family. Öcalan, in his body of work, shows us that whilst the woman's divinity and sacredness is first degraded and then obliterated, the dominant male is portrayed as the sovereign and absolute power. And it is so easy to draw parallels, whether it's the working class, whether it is the different ethnicity, culture, this can be understood very clearly. Thus, through extensive use of myths and legends, everything is wrapped in a relationship of ruler and ruled. creator and created, says Öcalan. Society was made to internalize this mythological world, and over time, it became the fundamental narrative and gradually religionized. So while the monopolies of capital throughout the 5,000 years are maintained over society, a continuous second parallel chain of monopoly is the male monopoly and colonization over woman's world, says Öcalan. Thus, she is the oldest and most powerful. This is the most oldest and most powerful monopoly. Öcalan determines that interpreting woman's existence as the oldest colonial realm will allow for more realistic conclusions. Thus, he defines women as the oldest colonized people who are not a nation. As Öcalan takes a closer look at the colonization of women, he draws our attention to the overwhelming and dehumanizing aspect of this colonization. Being confined in the home is not just spatial. It is not even like a prison confinement. He calls it being tantamount to the state of intense rape. Although women represented values such as production, education, leadership, and freedom for thousands of years, Öcalan emphasizes that she's battered so systematically and with diverse means of violence, and more so through ideological means of degradation. And he includes in this discourses on love, that the result is more than just total surrender. This means the complete loss of the woman's identity and her transformation into something completely different, a housewife. And her being a housewife, on the other hand, means the emergence of endless forms of power of disposal over her, including the right to kill her. She's not just a property, she is a very private property. For her owner, Öcalan says, she has the opportunity, she gives the opportunity to become a small emperor. Now, he points out that this very reality was one of the pillars that prepared the ground for patriarchal civilization and its expansion of colonization to the point that we are at today. Now, the success of the experiment with the woman, he says, meant that it could be now transferred to the whole of society. Öcalan argues that the process of this housewifeization, that is, the process of becoming subject to rule, domination, and ownership of society, was completed in the capitalist system. Now, through ideological tools and creation of increasing dependency on the state for sustainment of our living, as well as a thorough monopoly over force and violence and its usage, organization for the own interests of society and the individual is prevented. Some of these ways are the creation of individualism, the seeping of power in everyone, and the seductiveness of power, the creation of privileges, exploitation of one by the other, and the establishment of hierarchies, men over women, white over black, European over Middle Eastern or over African, rich over poor, capitalists over workers. Worst of all, over time, this becomes voluntarily accepted and reproduced and seen as the natural way of life. People are no longer able to imagine a way of living outside of these. So instead of rebelling against these conditions, everyone is trying to become the oppressor, not the oppressed, as a way out of the situation. All this in combination and when viewed in retrospective of the attacks against the democratic civilization paradigm of Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement, this is why the Kurds would like to say that Kurdish freedom struggle and similar such struggles around the world are above all struggles to remain human and are struggles to deconstruct colonization. I know I'm over my time limit, but let me just briefly talk about remedies. Now, over the several seminars that are planned, this will be done maybe thoroughly. But based on such a perspective of colonialism, what is to be done then? Or as Öcalan poses the question in volume 4 of his magnum opus, Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization, how to live, what to do, and where to begin. So as I mentioned in my short description of the talk, how do you then stop becoming complicit in this process of recolonization over and over again? The remedies Öcalan offers for the colonial situation of the Kurds and that of women are structurally similar. To allow for free and independent development, all those colonized, oppressed, and exploited must organize autonomously. To make any kind of free union between the peoples or the sexes possible, the oppressed side has to regain self-consciousness, regain its own knowledge, re-identify itself, organize itself, develop its own will, its own demands, and its own utopias. And it must be able to develop the strength to realize them. Only after this has happened, Öcalan says a free union is possible, whether on an individual level or at other levels. In this spirit, he initiated a Kurdish revolutionary organization from inside Turkey's leftist movement in the 1970s, and did everything he could to initiate and support an autonomous women's organization, exactly again from the very inside of the Kurdish freedom movement in the 1990s. Now, Öcalan's concept of democratic modernity, therefore, is not a search for a past golden age or a future utopian project that will never come true. Rather, it is the political philosophy of decolonization of life in general and of building free life in its place. The implementation of this political philosophy can be seen, especially in Rojava, Shengal, Mahmur, Bakur, to a certain extent in Bashur, and within the Kurdish communities in Europe and around the world. While a lot remains to be done, this paradigm shift away from building yet another nation state towards a liberation of life has inspired countless women and men to take their destinies into their own hands and to fight for and build a better, freer future for themselves and their societies. Capitalist modernity is the denial of love, Öcalan says, and for love and enchantment to return to life, there is a need to head for women's and people's global democratic civilization. Democratic modernity can exist as democratic communality, as eco-industrial society, and the democratic nation Rohan spoke at the beginning. He does not define democratic communality as the egalitarianism of homogeneous society, but as any kind of community of any size that carries the characteristics of moral and political society. He defines an eco-industrial society as the situation where agrarian village society and urban industrial society nourish one another and consist of eco-industrial communities. He defines the democratic nation as a new kind of nation, or rather as a nation with multiple identities, not as something that is equated with a state, and that of multiple cultures and multiple political formations, that is opposed to the homogenizing of the nation state, and whose basic political form will be a democratic confederalist practice and autonomous political formations that are seen in Rojava, in Shengal, in Mahmur, and throughout the struggle elsewhere. Now, to this end, Öcalan asks many questions throughout his defenses to the various courts which we have then published as books. Now, he asks questions and explores answers. So how must we turn then and interpret the resistance of the Middle East and resistance of the Kurds against capitalist modernity? He asks, can this region, the cradle of civilization, now become the grave for this modernity, capitalist modernity, and become the place of transition to the age of the utopias of a free life? Now, in the following days, you will further explore what is meant by all of this and how strikingly radical Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement are in their way to imagine free life. Öcalan recounts how in the 1970s, he once spoke passionately about the Kurds to an elderly man. And the elderly man responded, "My son, we are like the dead wood. Will you really be able to make us grow leaves?" Come the 2000s, these leaves are now blooming and signaling a new dawn in the Middle East. But these ideas are not going unchallenged, as you're all following. In fact, we are facing yet another wave of colonial expansion and occupation through military attacks, currently spearheaded by Turkey. The situation on İmralı Island prison, the completely isolated prison island where Abdullah Öcalan is held hostage in total solitary confinement, completely cut off from the outside world, corresponds to exactly this. The representative of the political will of millions of people is silenced in isolation. His people oppressed by nationalist and religious dictatorships, and their land occupied by foreign militaries. Colonialism, however outdated it may appear, is still alive in the 21st century. But just as everywhere else in the world, women's, people's, workers' aspirations to become free are even livelier and more alive. And its end is overdue in Kurdistan, and its downfall is just a question of time and of the joint freedom struggle of the oppressed in the Middle East and around the world. Thank you very much for your patience and listening to me.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Shari. That was really excellent. And what a better introduction, first seminar for this summer school. Thank you so much. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box, but I would like to also remind our attendees, participants in this seminar, if you would like to talk, just raise your hand and I will basically technically allow you to talk. I really want to a little bit more dig into this question of recognition, because this has been one of the very important issues for indigenous people all around the world, and probably you know that Aldra Simpson, the author of Mohawk Interrupters, also talks about this recognition or misrecognition. So maybe if I can use the privilege of moderating this seminar and ask you, Havin, how do you see that? And in the cases of indigenous people, sometimes not recognizing the state or the authority has been a powerful form of protest, a powerful form of resistance. But in the Kurdish case, we have been trying really hard to build peace, to make connections, to work with all the peoples of the region, especially in Turkey, if I may give this particular example. And still, our rights, our freedoms, our existence, as you mentioned, has been denied. And in the Kurdish movement, we see these two lines of resistance going together. That in one hand, we have this refusal system that we don't recognize the state power, but at the same time, we also want to change the political landscape of these countries with working with these countries. So if you could briefly talk about that, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, I mean, when we're talking of recognition, we're talking of two things, or even three things, I guess. What I try to really talk about recognition in my speech was the bit about Kurds were deemed non-existent. So therefore, like, as I said, Turkey said, okay, it was empty here when we came, because in fact, you know, not such a huge war was experienced between the Kurds back then and the Mongolians or the Seljuks or even the Ottoman Empire later. It was more about making agreements among themselves and establishing some kind of a political form, was a broad autonomy at the time back then. So therefore, the recognition I talk about is especially after European colonization and the making of states based on a single ethnicity or a single nation, equating the state with a nation, which meant that all the other nation states in the Middle East who were occupying Kurdistan could very easily go ahead and interpret it to the very extreme and deem the Kurds non-existent. So therefore, a lot of the discussion, especially at the beginning of the formation of the PKK, the energy was consumed with convincing the Kurds that they existed, you know. And I try to explain at length that even today around the world, this non-existent acceptance of Kurds being non-existent is threaded by the law of the various European countries, the terror lists of the US and whatever, to be able to push the Kurds back into the limits of non-existence. Because frankly, the struggle of Öcalan and the PKK began from there and continues to be able to reach it into a recognition in this sense. But the recognition, of course, that you talk about the indigenous forms that, on the contrary, do not recognize or refuse to recognize, is in a different sense. And of course, it's understandable where they are coming from, but in this sense, the Kurdish freedom movement is trying to analyze the different layers of colonization that has occurred in the Middle East, in the region, in Mesopotamia, and from there is trying to find ways of reliving together. So when this colonization process is not only true for the Kurds, but is also true for the Arab society, but is also true for the Turkish society and the Turkish individual or the Persian individual. He brings the colonization to a different level of understanding. And from there, he tries to articulate another understanding of ethnicity, another understanding of communal and social and political and philosophical existence. And to this end, tries to find a way of existence between the nation states that are there, because you won't be able to get rid of them overnight, and it's not possible. But not only that, to be able to work through this decolonization process and produce the mechanisms to explore how to become free and how to actually re-identify ourselves, whether as a woman, as a man, as a Kurd, as an Arab, as a society. Yeah, that's what I'd like.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 6 questions in the Q&A box, and I know that you can't see the questions or comments. So I'm gonna read 3 of them. So one of them has multiple questions in it. Is that okay? Should I just read 3 of them and then another 3, or do you want to go one by one? I can hear you.
I think if you can do like 2, 3 together, I think that should be okay, right?
Okay, I will do the first 2. So I'm just gonna read them. David Steinberg, I'm very interested in the section of sociology freedom where Öcalan ties the rise of the secular state in Turkey to the establishment of Israel. I have noted that there are parallels between discourse among Jewish people regarding Israel and amongst Kurds about the Kurdish state. Could you expand on the effects of decolonization within Kurdish discourse and how it might relate to anti-Zionism? How can the Palestinian and Kurdish question be linked in a way to address the world system? So it's a little bit more about the political side of the Kurdish issue. I'm going to read the second question. Maybe we can find some commonalities between them. Tabo Honkebrort, sorry for mispronunciation. Regarding anti-colonial struggle more generally, but also with Öcalan's thought specifically, I'm wondering about resolving the tension between nationalism and internationalism, or more specifically, the nation as a social construct tends to internal homogenization and thus exclusion based on various diversities, sexuality, gender, race, culture, thereby conflicting with the internationalism that appears to be more inclusive based on a shared idea of universal emancipation, but thereby rejecting homogenization in brackets, since they often imply some sort of social pressure or violence. So how can an anti-colonial struggle allow for diversity and universal emancipation? So sexual, gender, racial, etc. And there is one question from Mexico, Erica. She's asking in which context, in which extent, if it happened, Said Kırmızı Toprak thinking influenced the Öcalan's formulation about colonialism. So that question is a little bit different than others. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, the questions are pretty comprehensive, and I guess we won't be able to go into the very much depth of all of them. But as I said, over the many seminars there will be, I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion of some of the even questions that are asked here at the moment. Now, of course, how to connect Palestinian and Kurdish struggle. There's been a connection from the very, very early days since the 1970s. But of course, in developing the discourse of colonization, as well as the collapse of the real socialism and Soviet Union, what happened is that Öcalan went into more depth of understanding, why it was that many efforts of escaping colonization and occupation, or trying to solve the Kurdish question, was not actually happening. So instead of giving up after the collapse of the Soviet Union and real socialism, Öcalan continued to thread this line and continued to understand the roots of the problem. And despite the efforts actually made by Turkey and other powers to turn the Kurdish freedom movement into a more nationalistic movement, or into a movement that puts the Kurdish question above all else, including women's freedom and also other ethnicities, cultures, and etc. in the area. I think Öcalan and his friends, the Kurdish freedom movement, went quite the other way. And in doing that, I think they did not get bogged down in evaluating determining your own future, self-determination, in terms of having a nation state, or indeed in terms of even having a state. So when this evaluation was so profound, then the solution that was put up was not to actually go for a state, but to go for democratic confederalism, which would allow not only for Kurds, but also for women, but would also allow Arabs with tens of different nation states to actually be also one, or even the Turkic states themselves, or Armenians, or others in the region who are lacking this. So therefore, I think I think that this profound understanding and the walk of the human history throughout the 5,000 years allows Öcalan to be able to disconnect the rulers and the ruled of the same ethnicity throughout time, and through this uniting them all together in their struggle for a democratic civilization. In democratic nation, the question about anti-colonial movements and how these questions too, I think, let me just say a few more things on the history of the Jews. It's not, when he goes into the discussion of the history of the Jews, it's not really about the current politics of the Israeli state. Although, of course, he criticizes Israel's nation status tendency and Palestinian nationalism alike, and criticizes the both. And he talks about possibilities of a solution if Israel becomes democratic. And he says it is not at the moment. But what he really talks about, the struggle of the Jewish people against the different forces of civilization for thousands of years, and the attempts of their elites to take place in these, that they are struggling against. So, for example, this is the situation even today with the Kurds. On the one hand, certain part of the Kurdish society involved with the Kurdish freedom movement is struggling towards freedom and to decolonize all these concepts that we're talking about. But others, like the KDP, for example, what we're seeing is that the KDP is working with the different rulers in the region, like the Turkish state, against these forces, not to the benefit of the Kurds, but to the benefit of the of the colonizers. So he is criticizing them in the same manner and in the same light. So while we talk about the KDP, it's good to talk about maybe Kırmızı Toprak. I'm not aware how much he has influenced Öcalan, but in fact, this is how KDP, in fact, eliminated the leftist tendencies from the KDP, and successfully over the years, eliminating all these leftist women tendencies within itself. It became more and more a nationalist and a collaborationist force. And of course, you know, this is why I talked about the democratic nation proposal by Öcalan, because it does not exclude any group, and it does not homogenize.
Right. Thank you very much. There are two questions about women, so I'm probably, just because of time, I'm going to group them together. So an anonymous attendee asking, is the creation of categories of male and female considered a foundation of patriarchy in the Kurdish women's movement? And is the aim to one day overcome these categories? Much like how the scientific creation of different races by European colonialism was necessary for colonization, and how one day this ideology of race must be overcome. Okay, and the other one is also an anonymous attendee. Does the Kurdish women's movement consider the split categories of female as a foundation? Okay, I think it's the same thing. Okay, so this is one question about women's movement, and we also have, I would like to mention, we have a seminar on genealogy where people in the genealogy center in Brussels, and also the genealogy department, the University of Rojava, will talk about all of that extensively. I think it's next week on Wednesday. Probably I'm going to ask, better I ask another question. Do you think it's a good idea, or do you want to address this question, Irene?
I mean, I can just say a few words, and I'm sure, as I said, there will be much more discussions in the coming days. But I think we should not forget that this is an ongoing discussion. Women are discussing, the women's movement is discussing what is a woman, who is a woman, what do we want, and is trying to reconstruct the history of the democratic civilization and women in that light. So therefore, I don't think one should look at all these discussions as finished and done. But what we must also understand, as we talked about, the colonization process of men and women throughout the civilization, and what this has done to our perception of who and what is a woman, who and what is a man. But what is clear to Öcalan is that the woman-centered civilization, with all its social and value constructs, were colonized by the patriarchal civilization. and all her creations, social creations, were also co-opted. So the basis of the discussion, of course, comes from there, but it goes on to the different layers of this process and what they really mean. And as I said, this is a process of, from archaeology to oral history to the still standing structures in Kurdish society or other societies. So therefore, this is an ongoing discussion which will be discussed with the genealogy in the coming days as well.
Great. So there is another question about internationalism and nationalism. The question asks, what is the place of armed struggle in the context of anti-colonialist struggles? How can Öcalan's works help form an international anti-colonialist alliance, and how can we preserve the internationalism community harmony? Are there any common grounds between nationalists and anti-colonialists in this new era of struggles? Can we imagine a global community with its own culture and traditions? So this is one question, and also a student of us, Nujin, asking question in Kurdish. How can the concept and practice of democratic nation become a response, a solution for the new forms of colonization and colonialism around the world? There's one final question, but probably if you could respond to these two, maybe I'll ask that very last one. And in the meantime, if anyone else has any questions, please write them down in the Q&A box. Please, Harry.
Okay. Now, of course, the view that Öcalan takes on violence and force and armed struggle is very extensive. As we talked about how the colonization process developed, one of the three ways in which was violence itself, how it was monopolized by different colonizers or rulers throughout the 5,000 years. So I think the discussion here is very, very important, because it still looms over the discussions whether there needs to be an armed self-defense or not. And the way that we view peace, I think the way Öcalan describes how peace is come to be seen is a one-sided acceptance of the terms of the nation states today. So in fact, if the Kurds under these circumstances, instead of armed struggle, what should they have done? The path that is shown is a resistance of pacifistic resistance. But what we're seeing is that what has been imposed, not only on the Kurds, but also on workers, on women, on anyone else, is for there to be no tension, for there to be no conflict, for there to be a peace. The oppressed should, without resorting to defending herself or himself, should actually accept this. And this is how peace is actually achieved. Now, of course, there's also misunderstandings or by the revolutionary movements in terms of employing revolutionary violence. And I think Öcalan in Beyond State Violence and Power, he goes into this, especially also in terms of the Kurdish movement and the PKK and his own understanding of this issue. Therefore, he comes to the conclusion that what is important is to make sure that a monopoly, a military monopoly, is not born in the midst of this armed self-defense, and that it does not cross boundaries of this self-defense, and that the movements do not allow this monopoly of force within a certain movement to become a center of power and hierarchy. So therefore, there's a lot of different ways in which mechanisms have been established within the movement to develop this understanding of self-defense and to institutionalize self-defense in many different contexts, including women, including other ethnicities, including, all of these, and not only in terms of an armed self-defense, but in terms of education, but in terms of many developing themselves and their own decision-making capacity in the different areas of life, but particularly in terms of defending themselves physically against the assimilation, annihilationist, and occupational attempts by the colonizers. Armed self-defense, Öcalan sees as a must, until such day that the threat of such a power does not exist and it can be incorporated. So, yeah, in terms of democratic nation, I think it's so important because Öcalan is trying to show that administration is important, but it should not be deemed as sacred. And that this is why he talks about the moral and political society as well, that each individual of the society should have the means to develop all these aspects of what being an individual and part of a society is. So administration is not sacred, and this is why this can be universal. Homeland, language, borders, not sacred. It should not be bound to strict borders. So there should be not one language, one culture, one religion, or even a single interpretation of history. I mean, maybe you saw that in my speech. There were several interpretations of history that we, one in terms of women, and this we can bring until today. We can go and take it back to territories, the nature. So there are, and I guess, all the struggles that we have waged, different peoples, women, etc. We have exposed this different interpretation of history, and we are able to bring it as into one interpretation more and more. So there aren't one single interpretation, but different sides of the truth that we have experienced. So therefore, this allows for not strictly putting things into compartments and categories, but to be able to allow for these stunted developments of, women, Kurds, Arabs, Turks, or whoever, to determine its own development based on freedom, solidarity, and freedom of women, ecology, to reimagine its own development itself. So democratic nation, as a result, is an important concept, not only for the Kurds and the Middle East, but for the wider world.
This is great. Thank you very much. So probably a final question. We are a little bit over time as well. So Tung Nguyen is asking about maybe more the individual side of that, and asking about not just the minority people, but also those who are repressed, oppressed, isolated through conquer and division, and they're mentally, physically, structurally have been damaged, and their communities have probably destroyed So she or he is, or they, basically asking what are your thoughts on self-preservation in this context. And maybe I will also add to that, what is the role of individuals in a kind of dialectical relationship with their communities in the kind of process of decolonization. And there are many studies of how psychological affects colonization has on individuals in communities subjected to colonization. So I'm wondering, in reference to Öcalan's work on personality, as you mentioned, creating this free Kurd, how decolonization and these ideas and philosophy of Öcalan and are related to development and the emancipation of individuals.
Okay, I did not get the question about the preservation bit.
I think it was mainly about self-preservation for individuals, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so there is an explanation to that, to the point of self-defense and institutionalized self-defense in terms of education and empowerment against assimilation, and also be strategic satisfaction against colonizers' thought. I think that's what the, this question wants to say. Do you want to speak? I can also. I
mean, okay. I think, you know, I can say something pretty much general.
Oh, I'm very sorry about for the person who asked the question. If she, he, or they want to speak themselves. Let me see. No pressure though.
Okay. Okay, I think
I'm not seeing. Okay, yes, please, Ivy. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, I think Öcalan makes a very strong emphasis on society. You know, and in this light, I think it's important to see throughout time how all this fragmentation and the distinction of subject-object has really fragmented our own, not only way of thinking, but also doing, and also our acceptance in which all of this doing is taking place. So, and this is happening in many dimensions, because it's happening on a legal level in terms of laws. It's happening on a health level in terms of taking that away from us. So it's happening on a many different levels. And Öcalan is explaining that we cannot achieve freedom by the individual cutting its ties off with the society. And he's trying to understand how this optimum balance between society and the individual can be achieved. He doesn't see the society only as a sum of the individuals in it. He sees it a little bit more than that. And of course, the freer the individuals in it, the stronger the society can get. But this can only happen if the societal functions are there and the moral and political aspect of society, which Öcalan finds very important. And he chases this moral and political society from before the 5,000 years to date, to be able to show that society, what makes society is its moral and political aspect, which means that its ability to determine society itself, what is good and what is bad, and to determine these principles instead of the elites, the rulers, the colonizers, those who who usurp our surplus product or values instead of them. The society determines this. And over the thousands of years of layers of this colonization, the society is no longer able to determine for its own self what these principles are. And its political dimension is about the ability to make its own decisions. So therefore, in the examples of Rojava and Shengal and Mahmud and places like this, mechanisms are being established to be able to reinvigorate both individuals' own understanding of himself or herself or themselves or whatever, but also to be able to find this balance between its own self and the society at large and society's own function. So therefore, you know, in terms of self-defense too, Öcalan and the movement does not take this only on an individual level, but at an organized level. And education in that light as well. I mean, Rohan at the beginning mentioned the experience of Rojava universities in Rojava to be able to produce knowledge for the society and for the society and different groups within the society producing knowledge for themselves to further this understanding of all of these, what these topics are. As I said, for example, what is love, you know, on an individual level? What is freedom on an individual level? And how does this come into play in terms of this optimum balance with the society? How do we view the society itself? So all of these are, I think, are important discussions with which Öcalan went into even before 99. You know, he discussed what Kurdish love is and what happened to the woman in this situation of what is called love, and what happened to the men in this situation of what is called love. And how is this, on the one hand, denial of identities, and on the other hand, excessive fragmentation of the society and not being able to come together for basic demands and rights created by the state and the rulers. How can this be overcome through the overcoming of this culture embedded in us? So I guess there is a huge psychoanalysis in Öcalan's earlier books, but it's not just psychoanalysis. You know, he takes and firmly roots this in class, in sexism, in collaborationism that comes through the historical chain, you know, through colonization of all these various ways. So it's not just on a psychology level, but he couples all of this with power, hierarchy, force, ideological construction, and everything else, and then tries to reinvigorate, as I said, the individual and the society to an optimal balance.
That was great. Well, thank you so much, Havin. I'm not sure if you have any final comments. We are a little bit over time, so I think we can conclude this seminar with your final comments. Please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, nothing much to say, but just to say that things may look as if they are insurmountable because the colonizers on all levels have the benefit of the mechanisms of the state and this accumulation of how to colonize and how to enslave throughout the 5,000 years. But what Öcalan is trying to say is that we also have an accumulation of knowledge and that we need to bring that more together both historically and presently, to be able to make benefit of this chaotic period right now, to tip the balance over for democratic civilization and freedom for all. Thank you very much for your preparation for the seminar series, Sardar.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Havin, for your invaluable remarks, really. And I also would like to thank our interpreter for his work on this seminar today. And before ending today's seminar, I would like to remind everyone that tomorrow we have the second public seminar, and details of which you can find on our website, the center's website, CSCUNES.com. I think our friends shared it in the chat box as well. So please make sure to register. Thank you all, and have a great one.
Thank you, Jalil, as well. Your work is invaluable, I know.
Take care.